Hello and welcome to another entry in the Astrologer's Encyclopedia. My name is Matt. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to attempt to record this under the influence of this Jupiter-Neptune transit. An exact 3 minutes ago, so we are going to see how this goes. Today we're going to be talking about aspects. So I'm just going to get right into it. I don't really have any announcements. So I'm just going to share my screen and start the show. So here we have a little title slide. Like I said, we're talking about aspects. Table of contents. Today, we're going to be discussing a couple of definitions that are a definition of aspects, the word itself, as well as a couple other related terms that we need to know. And then we're going to discuss the classical aspects or classical configurations, which are the trine, square, opposition, sextile, conjunction, and then aversion is kind of a special case. Then we're going to talk about applying and separating aspects, superior and inferior aspects, aspects in the thema mundi, and then also just a quick note on Anticia and signs of equal rising. What we're not going to be discussing is the modern minor aspects, so things like quincunxes and quintiles, and I'm not very familiar with them, but I have a couple, at least one resource where you can go learn about those if you want to. So what are aspects? Aspects are the geometrical relationships formed between planets and also signs in a chart, in a birth chart, in a horary chart, in an electional chart. And so the English word aspect comes from the Latin word aspectus, which means appearance, gaze, sight, or like the horizon. One way that this kind of Latin usage is maybe still more in use is like in an aspect ratio on like a camera or on a TV, you can set it to like the ratio of viewing. That would be also related. And then there is this Greek term epimarteria, which was used to refer to the aspects, which has more connotations of, it's similar in like that it's related to sight and viewing, but it has these more legal connotations of like bearing witness or testifying, as in like in a courtroom. I'm just going to clean my glasses. And so this is really interesting, where we think of planets that are in aspect to each other as they are able to affect each other for better or worse by, like, in the same way that, like, if you are on trial, like if we're, trying Mars for how he's going to show up in this native's life, and you have Saturn square to him, you have Saturn in the court of astrology, like slandering him and disrupting his ability to bear his significations in like a way that's productive for the native. So that's this word epimarteria. That's the Greek term that was used. So I have a couple of quotes. They're kind of long, but I'm just going to read them. This first one is from Porphyry, translation by James Holden, Porphyry chapter 8. And he says, they call the mutual configurations of the stars aspects, and their configurations are these. The trine consists of 5 signs. And so they start, like, they count the first sign as 1. So if we start with like Aries, we would say 1, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo. So those signs are trine to each other. Whenever there are 3 signs in between the two, so he kind of explains that. And the square of 4, whenever there are 2 signs in between them. So same thing, if we start with Aries, we say Aries is the first sign, Taurus is the second, Gemini is the third, Cancer is the fourth. Those signs are square to each other. There's 2 in between. The opposition of 7, so same thing. If we count Aries all the way out to Libra, that would be the opposition. Or any other sign out 7 signs, there are going to be 5 in between. And the sextile of 3, whenever there is 1 sign in the middle of them. So this is just laying out what the basic aspects are. Notice that he does not include the conjunction. The conjunction is not quite the same as an aspect. If we think of the aspect as relating to like a line of sight or a testimony, the conjunction is more of a blending, where like if you have, Saturn and Mercury together in one sign, you would like join their significations and say that that would be productive in that house or sign. Whereas if you had Saturn square Mercury, you would have them like acting upon each other, but not necessarily blending their significations. So that is Porphyry. Now we have Demetra George in Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, Volume 1. So she says, the model that informs these classifications is a geometric substructure based on the division of the circle by whole numbers, the conceptual meaning ascribed to each number, and the regular polygons that can be inscribed into the zodiacal circle. These polygons are the six-sided hexagon. That would be the sextile. And I'll show you guys, I'll draw out all of these as we go forward. These polygons are the six-sided hexagon, the four-sided square, that would be obviously the square, the three-sided triangle for the trine, and the diameter, which bisects the circle. When these geometric figures are inscribed within the 12-fold division of zodiacal signs, they link together certain sets of signs that are hence related to one another in specific ways. So we're going to get into this, especially that last sentence, as we go forward. So now we're going to go into the classical aspects, and I'm going to go in the same order that Porphyry described. So we're going to do the trine, and then the square, and then the opposition, and then the sextile. So starting with the trine, we have 5 signs or 120 degrees apart. So in this example, we have the sun and the moon are going to be trine to each other. You will always know that planets are in a trine relationship when they're in signs of the same element. So if I keep drawing these out, we see that Aries is trine to Leo, Leo is trine to Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is trine to Aries, right? And so this is where aspects are by whole sign in ancient astrology. As we move forward in time, we start to get the concept of orbs, where it's like, the aspect would be active on, like, depending on who you ask, like 7, 8, 9 degrees on either side of the sun. For the moon, it's usually bigger. But anyway, so the trine is, according to Porphyry, the configuration by trine are sympathetic and helpful. And if it is destructive, it is less harmful. So I think what he means by that is, if, like, let's say this were Saturn instead of the sun, if Saturn is trine the moon, Saturn is usually, his gaze is, kind of icy and destructive and malefic. But if he's relating by trine, then it's a little bit softer and he can actually be helpful. This is like one of the scenarios in which you'll hear in a lot of the ancient authors, they'll be like, the malefics are indicative of harm and suffering, but sometimes they can be good. An example of that would be like if they are in a trine to each other, and if there's things like reception and all this. So Ibn Ezra says a planet in its triplicity is like a person with his relatives. And what he's talking about here really is more like if a planet has like rulership by triplicity, like where the sun in Aries, if this is the day chart, the sun would be like in its own triplicity, and it still would be by night chart, but more so in a day chart. It would be like a planet that's with its relatives. But I think it really does apply to planets that are trine to each other, because they are sort of engaging and partaking of the same element. So there's going to be something about them in the native's life that is like sympathetic and helpful, right? According to Porphyry. And so, like I said, we will always see that the planets or the signs linked by trine are going to be related by triplicity or element, and also gender. So if we see the planets are the same element, if it's 2 fire signs, then they're always going to be 2 masculine signs. And there's going to be something about these planets in the native's life that is sympathetic. So that's that. The next one that we're going to look at is the square. So the square is 4 degrees or 4 signs or 90 degrees apart. So again, we have the sun and the moon. We have the sun in Aries, square to the moon in Cancer. These signs are related by quadruplicity or modality. So these are both cardinal signs, but you see they differ by gender and they differ by element. So this is a little bit more of an antagonistic relationship. Porphyry says the square is harsh and discordant and able to cause trouble if it is destructive. And there's a really special condition when we get to inferior and superior aspects. We see that when a planet is square to another and they're in the 10th sign relative to another. So if we take the moon here and we count off 10 signs, we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We get to Aries. The sun is here in Aries. And there's this notion of the planet on the 10th sign like dominating and like having the upper hand over the other planet. And so there is this relation of like subordination and dominance, right, over the inferior planet. And this can be really negative if, like, let's say, for example, it's Mars overcoming the moon. If you think again of like the courtroom analogy, the courtroom image, we think of like, let's say this is Mars overcoming the moon. Mars is like threatening the moon, giving like negative testimony, like incriminating the moon, making it like really difficult for the moon to really get anything done. If it was Saturn, maybe Saturn would be like stalling in the courtroom, right? It would be like making it impossible for the moon to do anything just because she has to wait. And so this would directly affect the moon's significations and make them worse. Now, on the other hand, if we had Jupiter square to the moon and Venus square to the moon, there would be this like dominant and powerful positive influence, right? And so when we see a benefic square to any other planet, that can be usually interpreted as being like quite positive. Not always. It depends on the condition of both planets. But, you know, if we think of the sun overcoming the moon, if we think of like one signification of each, we think of like the father and the mother, or we think of like the mind and the body. We can think of like the relationship between this person's two parents. Perhaps the father had the upper hand and was sort of dominant over the mother. Or we can think of this person having like an intellectual and a spiritual life that is overcoming and negates the like physical bodily health even, or like life of the native that can be like reclusive in that way. So that's just a couple of ways that the square might play out. The square is usually seen as one of the two more difficult aspects, and it's of the nature of Mars. And we're going to get to that, this like of the nature of later. The trine, I don't know if I said it, is of the nature of Jupiter. So the trine is usually seen as like the most positive aspect. And yeah, so it's of the nature of Jupiter, and we'll see why later. So next up is the opposition. These are going to be 7 signs apart. So again, or actually I'm going to go back to the square and just show you. It should be kind of obvious. But if we go Aries to Cancer, those signs are square. Cancer to Libra, those signs are square. Libra to Capricorn, those signs are square. And then back to Aries. My drawing kind of sucks, but it is a nice regular polygon, nice square. It's a very like Greek thing. I feel like to be like all of these perfect geometrical shapes are the only things we will consider because they're like divine and amazing. So the opposition is not a regular polygon, but it is just this neat division of the circle into two hemispheres. So they're always going to be 7 signs or 180 degrees apart. Signs are related by quadruplicity and gender. And so it's kind of interesting that this is considered to be like more antagonistic and oppositional than the square. You know, you might think that because the square only relates on one like sign quality instead of 2, that the square might be more oppositional, or like antagonistic and filled with conflict. But I think there is kind of a connotation of the square being like, there's like friction, but the planets are sort of going in 2 different directions. They're not like directly butting heads always. So you can kind of work with a square in a way that's maybe a little bit easier. And the square is always like unidirectional, where it's, and we're going to get to this with inferior and superior aspects, where like if the sun is square right here to planet in Cancer, the sun's influence is being felt, not really this other planet's, where in an opposition, they're both kind of acting upon each other. And so maybe you can think of it as it's like being more of a fair fight. You can also think of it as like these planets have more in common. And so the thing that they disagree on, they like really disagree on, whereas planets that are square to each other, they don't have a ton in common. They only have the quadruplicity and the modality, which would be like, you know, it would be 2 cardinal signs. So these signs are both like have this initiatory energy. They both are like trying to do many different things and like jump from one thing to another, but they're trying to jump between different things in very drastically different ways. Like a planet in Aries is going to be obviously hot, fiery, much more quick, going to produces significations earlier in life, where a planet in Cancer might be a little bit more internal, might be a little bit more nocturnal, and take a little bit longer to produce its significations. And so they have a little bit less in common, whereas like Aries and Libra are both cardinal signs, but they're both also masculine signs, which is interesting to think about. The you know, it's like the things that enemies often have in common, you know, that can be perhaps signified by the opposition. So Porphyry says that the opposition is antagonistic and worse if it is malefic. So again, it's always going to be worse if you have like Saturn opposed to something versus if you have like Jupiter opposed to something. It's still not really good to have, I mean, not good, but it like can be kind of a contradiction in the person's life, and it can be kind of difficult for them if they have lots of oppositions. And so it could be like two parts of this native's life really don't agree. So if we have an opposition between the second and the eighth, I think Prince had not these signs, but this houses, and I think it might have been the sun and the moon. It might have been the sun and Saturn. But he had this long running like financial conflict with like his record label. So opposition between the second and the eighth could be like a contradiction in this person's life between like what is theirs and what is someone else's. People are trying to lay claim to his property and say that it's theirs, and he's trying to like reclaim it and like stand firmly on what he owns, these kinds of things. So that would be like an opposition. We could think of it also in like, if we have an opposition between the first and the seventh, there could be a contradiction between the health of the native and the health of their relationships, or the native and their husband or wife, or their business partners. All these kinds of things. Between the 10th and the 4th, there could be like part of the native is pulled out into their career, part of the native is pulled down into their home, and they can't really, it's hard to satisfy both. And so that is the opposition. So next up, we have the sextile. These are going to be 3 signs or 60 degrees apart. And we can see here that the sun and the moon, again, are sextile to each other. If we keep drawing out these sextiles, then we get a nice hexagon. Again, my drawing is not the best, but you just have to live with it. So the only thing that Porphyry says about sextiles is just the sextile is feebler. So, oh, and I forgot to say oppositions are of the nature of Saturn, but the sextile is feebler. It's a positive aspect. It's of the nature of Venus, but these planets only relate by gender. So, or whatever term you feel like using for that. So we see like Aries and Gemini are going to be both masculine signs. They're going to be a fire and an air sign. And we see Aries and Aquarius are going to also be masculine signs. If we move over to like Pisces, Pisces and Taurus, and Pisces and Capricorn are going to be 2 feminine signs. And so you see that, again, these planets are relating on like not necessarily everything, but they're relating on like how the like pace at which they bring about their significations to a certain extent. And so if we think of trines as being like your family, right, like your direct blood family, sextile could be like your close friends or the people that you associate with, or like the people that you just like have an affinity for that aren't necessarily related to you. And so there's less like direct, like maybe legal ties. Even if we think of like the legal paradigm of like the aspects, we think of the trine as being like a little bit more tight knit. They relate on 2 things rather than 1. And so there's this more obvious, perhaps more like legally binding contract, rather than with the sextile, there's just a bit less of a bond. But yeah, so that's 3 signs or 60 degrees apart. And we can really just think of it as like, if we have the sun here sextile to the moon, instead of like earlier we were looking at the sun square to the moon, we can think of the natives like intellectual or spiritual striving, and like the image that they're trying to like manifest in this life, reflecting nicely upon their health and upon their circumstances and upon their like daily rhythm of life. Or if we think of it as like the father and the mother, we can think of them as being like affectionate towards one another and sort of in harmony in some way, right? So that is the sextile. So those are 4 of the main aspects. Those are really all of the like quote unquote aspects. The next one I think is going to be the conjunction, also called co-presence sometimes. This is not really quite the same as an aspect, because like I said earlier, there are these connotations of like lines of sight and like testimony being given. And when you're in the same sign, it's almost like, as Chris Brennan says, it's when 2 planets are in the same sign, it is like they're living in the same house together. So it's not that you're like looking out and seeing the other planet, but it's that you're like in the same place. It's just a little bit different. And so the significations of the 2 planets are blended together. And so, you know, if we see like the sun and the moon in the 6th house, again, we think of the sun as being like the image of the native's life that is sort of like central to it, and the moon being like the rhythm of their life, the health of their body. Those things would be like in sort of a union in the sixth house, which could be like, they really strive to help the poor, or strive to be a good physician or doctor, right? Especially if in this chart we see the 10th and the 9th, perhaps they would be like really committed to being a professor, or like a doctor, or someone who helps the poor in foreign countries, or learns foreign languages. And there's this really tight knit union of like their identity and the things that they do, or it could be between their mother and their father, or it could be, perhaps that if they're this close, it could be that the mother and father role were taken up by one person, or all of these kinds of things. You get this blending. It's not so much that like one is acting upon the other, but that they're sort of linked in some way. And so finally, with conjunctions, we think of them as being always by whole sign in ancient astrology. That's not true of modern astrology. And for any aspect, we think of them as always being by whole sign, but just like more powerful as they become closer and closer. So like, let's say we had the moon at 28 Aries and the sun here at 7, they would still be considered co-present. But I think Chris Bernard has an example in his book where it's like, if they're really far apart in the same sign, it would be like if you're downstairs in the living room and they're upstairs on the other corner of their house in the bedroom. You're still in the same house together. You're still going to affect each other, but it's just like not quite as potent. Like you're going to hear the person walking around, and you might see them as they walk down the hall to the bathroom or something. But if you're like this close, if you're both at 7 degrees, you're like sitting on the same couch together. And so you're going to have a really strong influence. And so like, let's say it was the moon and Mars that are really close together. It would be like really difficult for the moon, and probably also really difficult for Mars. There would be like a definite risk of bodily injury or harm coming from Mars. And so that's where like they do affect each other in similar ways to an aspect, but it's not, the rationale is just slightly different. So the final thing that we're going to look at is aversion. So when we look at this, this is kind of an overlapping topic with like the modern minor aspects, but a little bit different. So when we think of planets in aversion, remember earlier with all the aspects I was talking about, like how they relate to each other based on different sign qualities. Signs are in aversion to signs that they share no qualities with. So it would be the 2nd, 12th, 6th, and 8th. I'll redraw those arrows, those are terrible. 6th and 8th from any given sign are going to be in aversion. And what that means is that they don't see each other. They don't relate to each other. So if you think of Aries as a masculine, fiery, movable or cardinal sign, right? Those are the 3 qualities, and it's ruled by Mars. You can think of Pisces as being a feminine. They don't relate on that. A double-bodied, they don't relate on that. And a watery sign, there's nothing in common. And same thing with Taurus. There is a fixed, right? Aries is cardinal. Earth is Taurus, Aries is fire, and Taurus is feminine, Aries is masculine. They don't relate on anything. And so when 2 planets are in these signs, there can be like a feeling of they don't see each other. These 2 parts of life don't really affect each other. And it can be interpreted as being kind of negative, especially if, like, let's say the sun is here in Aries and Mars was in Pisces, then Mars would be unable to like assist the sun with its needs. Remember a couple of videos ago, we were talking about like domicile rulerships, and we were talking about how when a planet rules a sign, it's responsible for any other planets in that sign. But if it's averse to its own house, to its own sign, then it can't help, and it will fail in that duty, and the planets in that sign will be worse off. So there's kind of a special case where we think of like if Mars was in Scorpio, or if any planet was in Scorpio and the sun is in Aries, they still can relate by rulership, which is kind of an interesting thing. I haven't really seen too much like writing about that. But I think there would definitely be a way where like someone who has like the moon in Aries and the moon in Scorpio would get along in a certain way based on the common rulership by Mars, but they might go about enacting that Martian lunar quality in very different ways. So Just kind of continuing, we see that the sixth sign would also be averse. Again, we have a double-bodied earthy feminine sign with a masculine masculine fiery cardinal sign. And then finally, Scorpio, we have a fixed watery feminine sign, and then we have a cardinal fiery masculine sign. So there's no relationship between these, and it's generally seen as a not a positive configuration. But again, it can kind of go either way, where it can be kind of nice if you have a planet that's averse to both malefics, where the malefics won't have an influence on it. But it can be a really bad thing if a planet is averse to both benefics, right? Where they will be, and especially if they're in aversion to their ruler, they'll be kind of stranded. So that is aversion, and that completes our tour of the classical aspects. So that is 5 plus aversion. And these would all be modern aspects. I don't know what these ones would be, but there is an aspect that's 30 degrees. I know that the 6 signs would be a quincunx. I think this would also be a quincunx. I know this is a yod, where there's the 6 signs, and then the sextile if there's 3 planets right there. But anyway, moving on. So now we have applying and separating aspects. This is really important in both traditional and modern astrology, I think. And so basically what this is we're asking, will the aspect be perfected by degree or not in the future, right? So in this case, this is the sun is here at 16 degrees of Aries. The moon is at 1552 of Leo. If we go forward in time, the moon will continue moving this way and catch up to the sun. This is what we call an applying aspect. And so if this is a birth chart, then we would think of the applying aspect as being more important and more relevant to the native's future and their life, rather than, let's say the moon was here at 18 degrees Aries. It would still be very close, but the moon would be separating, and therefore the influence of the aspect would be declining. And so then it might have less potent relevance to the native's life. This is really, really important in horary, the application and separation of different signifiers, where you'll get a yes to your answer if the 2 relevant signifiers are applying, and you get a no if they're not, basically. And it depends on the aspect, how much effort we'll have to go into it and all that. But the basic thing is that applying aspects are building in strength and have yet to fully manifest. So like I said, they're more relevant to the future, and they are still building in strength. Excuse me. And separating aspects are past their peak, fading in strength, and indicate things that have already happened, but are now fading away. So really important. And now we have superior and inferior aspects. So this is just the same chart. We see that planets that come before in the order of signs are said to overcome the other planet in the aspect. Excuse me. So here we have the sun overcoming the moon. And I already explained a lot of this earlier, where it's this, in this case, the moon would be the planet that's on trial, and the sun would be giving positive witness testimony. And so in this case, it would be really, really positive because, and I don't think I have a slide on it, but reception is basically the moon is here in the sun sign and the sun is casting a trine on it. That's really, really good because, and the sun is exalted. So if you think of it as the moon is a guest in the home of the sun, and the sun is living it up and is available to help, and is wealthy and has status and is can really help you out. And so the moon is going to be doing really well. And it's connection between the 2nd and the 6th houses. So it could be the testimony from this wealthy, empowered, self-employed president of a company, sun in the 2nd house is really benefiting the 6th house in some way, the natives' work, their duty to their community, any of these kinds of things. And so there is this Greek word, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, which is just having the upper hand or superior. This is the term that they would use to refer to this. And I think it was Schmidt who said this. I can't remember who I quoted this from. I think it was Robert Schmidt said, it's a wrestler who falls atop his opponent. And so it becomes especially relevant when planets are square to each other, where they have this really dominant relationship. With the trine, it's a little bit less violent, maybe. And so like, let's say we had, again, Saturn and Taurus overcoming this moon, then there would be this like really heavy influence coming from Saturn to the moon, but not the other way around, where if we had Saturn here in like Scorpio, then the moon would be overcoming Saturn in that way. And so the moon's influence would be reflected upon Saturn. And so you see here that it's a little bit more complicated than just like the moon square Saturn means this. It's like who's on top, who is the dominant planet, what signs are they in, what houses are they in, are they applying, are they separating? It's really intricate. Okay, so finally, I think this is, we have 2 more slides. The aspect relationships in the Thema Mundi it's really interesting how they're illustrated. So if we think of the relationship of each domicile to the sign of the light that is in that hemisphere. So if we break up the Thema Mundi into 2 hemispheres, so we think of the lunar hemisphere is up here on the top and the solar hemisphere is down here on the bottom. Kind of interesting, kind of reversed. But we think of Venus having a sextile to the sun, Mars having a square to the sun, Jupiter having a trine to the sun, and Saturn being opposed to the sun. Isn't that cool? And then if we flip it, and Mercury is a verse, which is kind of interesting. But if we flip it, we have Venus would take her domicile in Taurus, sextile to the sun. Mars would take his domicile in Aries, to the moon. Jupiter would take his domicile in Pisces, trine to the moon, and Saturn would take, oops, I did that wrong. Let me restart. So basically, I mean, you get the gist. Venus has the sextiles to the 2 lights. Mars has squares. Jupiter has trines. And Saturn, they kind of cross like that. Saturn has oppositions. So if you think of it like if 2 planets are in a square relationship, then you could think of their relationship as being like Mars. It's like infused with the quality of Mars, and it's combative, right? And that's kind of interesting if you think of a opposition. It's Saturnian in that it is just negating, right? Where it's like the lights represent light and life and vitality, and Saturn represents the direct opposite, being dark and winter and ignorant and declining in health and dying, right? And whereas Mars isn't necessarily opposed to the sun, Mars and the sun actually get along. It's just that Mars is kind of an extreme version of the sun, which is kind of interesting if you think of in the Thema Mundi, Mars is receiving the overcoming heat of the sun, and one of Mars's significations is like intemperate heat. I never noticed that. It's kind of interesting. But then you also get things like where Aries is trine to Leo, and so therefore you get Leo is being exalted in Aries. So you have this, like sometimes Mars and the sun really get along, but sometimes Mars kind of maybe gets the short end of the stick and gets burned. That kind of thing. So finally, just a very quick note on Anticia and equal rising. So this is kind of complicated and definitely don't need it to like do good astrology, but I like it. So if we break up the wheel right here by where the summer and winter solstice are, so Cancer and Capricorn, we think of the signs that are like on equal sides as being the signs that are Anticia to each other. I don't know if that's the proper usage, but I wish I had looked up what that word actually, like if there's like a etymology of it, but basically you think of it as they mirror each other in terms of the length of daylight. And so if we have a planet here at, let's say 15 Gemini and a planet here at 15 Cancer, those degrees in the solar year have the same amount of daylight. And so they can be said to relate in that way. And so what you always want to look for is planets that are equidistant from the solstice, and that the degrees add up to 30. So let's say we had a 10-degree Taurus planet and a 20-degree Leo planet. Those would be Anticia. And you really want, this is not necessarily by whole sign. I think you really want to make sure you're close to the degrees within like a couple of degrees. But Anticia are said to be like a hidden or secretive conjunction or reluctant friendship. Again, I cannot remember where I quoted this from. think it was from Dimitri George's book, but I'm not certain. I'm almost positive. And so on the other end of this, we have some things that are called like contra Anticia, but you also hear equal rising. And so that would be if you divide in the same way by the equinoxes, and you go across in the same way. And it's the same thing. You always want them to add up to 30. And in her book, Dimitri George, I'm just going to roll with it that it's from that book, says that both of them are like a reluctant conjunction, but I've also heard that the contra Anticia or equal rising signs are like a more like an opposition. And so again, it's the same thing. You would want to look for like a planet at, 22 Aries and 8 Pisces, right? Because it adds up to 30. And sometimes you'll see like different schemes for this. Like sometimes you'll see like for the Anticia, you would see like Gemini going to Leo. I think that's in Porphyry actually. And I think it has to do with because back in that time they didn't have 0 Cancer was the solstice. It was like a little bit more into Cancer. It was like 5 or 6 degrees or something. And so it was more like this actually. Right. And then so Cancer and Capricorn are kind of left out, which is maybe an interesting scheme to kind of think about, and would maybe be, earlier we were talking about how there's a lot that's actually in common in signs that are opposed. And I think often in life, things that are opposed, that, they disagree so much because they actually have quite a bit in common. Maybe that's an interesting thing to kind of play with. But anyway, oops. There we go. Finally, I just have some resources here. These are some works that I cited and some things that I think might be useful, as well as some podcasts. So we have, as always, Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune, Dimitri George's Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, Volume 1. I heard today that Volume 2 is coming out on the 20th, I think, of April. We have Porphyry's Introduction to the Tetrabiblos, translated by James Holden. Stephen Forrest, The Inner Sky, has like a modern treatment of the aspects, which I really didn't go into much here, honestly, because I don't feel like I really understand it, and also because I think the ancient approach is a lot richer. And then there are 3 episodes of the Astrology podcast that I would recommend. There are Aspect Patterns in Astrology with Carol Taylor. That's, again, going to be kind of a modern approach where you get things like T-squares, kites, yods, these kinds of things. I really, really enjoyed that episode. Episode 323 is pretty much what I just did. It's just aspects in astrology, the 5 major configurations. And then 328 is going to be minor aspects with Rick Levine. I haven't actually heard this one yet, but Rick Levine is great. So I can't imagine it's bad. So yeah, thank you all very much for watching. If you really like this, make sure to subscribe, boost the channel, leave a comment with any topics or questions that you want me to cover in the future. I think I might get in the habit of doing like Q&As if there's enough interest for those. Maybe we'll do them live. I'm also on Twitter at @the_Astropedia, and in my bio there you'll find links to this channel. If you're here, you obviously already know that. I also have a blog that I just started where I'm doing sort of like informal writing on transits and other topics. I have a very short piece on the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. So yeah, thank you very much.